Robert Reckoning, From Family Disrespect to Financial Freedom, A Journey of Revenge, Power, and Rebirth After a Baby Shower Betrayal. I stood in my office, staring out the window at the city skyline. My phone pressed against my ear as Linda's voice came through, sharp and demanding. She wanted me to cover the final payment for her baby shower, an extravagant affair her mother, Diane, had insisted on throwing. I'm Robert, a senior financial consultant who's worked hard to build a solid career, but in my own home, I might as well be a stranger. Linda's family, with their old money and entitled attitudes, never saw me as one of them. To Diane, I was just the man who got lucky, someone who stumbled into their wealth by marrying her daughter. It didn't matter that I'd been the one keeping Linda afloat all these years, paying the bills, covering her whims, making sure she never had to lift a finger. They still looked down on me like I was beneath them. Her voice cut through my thoughts again, insistent, almost whining. Michael, it's just a few $1,000s. You know how important this is to me. Mom and Tessa will flip if it's not perfect. I could picture Diane's smug face, her lips pursed as she reminded me of my place, and Tessa, Linda's younger sister, chiming in with that grating laugh of hers. I clenched my jaw, my fingers tightening around the phone. I wanted to say no, to tell her I was done being their personal ATM, but I knew what would happen if I refused. Diane would spin it into a sob story, how I didn't care about my own child, how I was selfish and ungrateful. Tessa would back her up and Linda would just sit there, letting them tear me apart like they always did. So, I swallowed the frustration bubbling in my chest and muttered, "Fine. I'll handle it." She didn't even say thank you, just hung up with a quick, "Good. See you there." I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. The baby shower was tomorrow and I just agreed to shell out more money for a party I didn't even want to attend. It wasn't about the baby, not really. It was about them showing off, proving they were still the elite family they thought they were. I'd seen the receipts piling up, the venue, the catering, the decorations, all of it over the top, all of it unnecessary. And yet here I was footing the bill again. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to prove myself to them, working late nights to afford their lifestyle, letting them walk all over me because I loved Linda, or at least, I used to think I did. Now, I wasn't so sure. As I sat there, something shifted inside me. This wasn't just another favor, another hit to my bank account. It felt different, heavier. I'd been bending over backwards for them for too long, and for what? To be treated like I didn't belong in my own family? I glanced at the stack of papers on my desk, financial reports, budgets, plans I'd been working on for months. I was good at my job, damn good, and I'd built something for myself despite their sneers. Maybe it was time they learned that. I picked up my phone again, not to call Linda back, but to check my accounts. I scrolled through the numbers, the savings I'd tucked away, the investments I'd kept quiet about. They didn't know half of what I'd been doing, how much I'd held back, the baby shower payment would go through. I'd keep my word, but as I stared at those figures, a plan started forming in my head. This wasn't going to be like the other times. They thought they could keep pushing me, keep taking, but they were wrong. I wasn't just the guy who got lucky anymore. I was done playing their game. I'd write the check, show up tomorrow, smile through their nonsense. But this would be the last time. They had no idea what was coming. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, a strange calm settling over me. Let them have their party. Let them think they'd won. Because after tomorrow, everything was going to change and they wouldn't see it until it was too late. I got up, grabbed my jacket, and headed for the door. The city lights flickered outside as I locked up my office, my mind already racing ahead. Linda's voice echoed in my head, her casual expectation that I'd just fall in line. Diane's condescending tone, Tessa's snide remarks, they'd all gotten too comfortable treating me like this. I'd let it happen, sure, but that was on me. Not anymore. I stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut with a quiet thud. Tomorrow, I'd walk into that baby shower like nothing was wrong, hand over the money, and play my part. But inside, I'd be counting down the minutes. This wasn't just about a payment. It was the beginning of the end for them, for us, for everything they thought they could control. And as the elevator descended, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years, power. They'd pushed me too far, and now they were going to pay for it. One way or another, I was taking back what was mine. I sat in the living room that night, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the TV Linda had left on upstairs. She was already in bed, probably scrolling through her phone, planning more ways to spend money I'd earned. I leaned back on the couch, a glass of water in my hand, staring at the ceiling as my mind drifted back, way back, to all the times I'd let her family walk over me. I'm Robert, a guy who spent years building a career as a financial consultant. But to them, I was just the sucker who married into their world. They didn't care about the late nights I'd worked, the deals I'd closed, the life I'd made for us. No, to Linda's family, I was the hired help, the guy who paid the bills while they looked down their noses at me. It started even before the wedding. I remembered sitting across from Linda at a diner, her eyes sparkling as she talked about the big day she wanted, white roses, a live band, a venue that screamed money. I'd nodded along, happy to see her happy, and when the bill came, I paid it. All of it. Her parents didn't chip in a dime, even though Diane bragged about their wealth every chance she got. A man takes care of his wife's family, she'd said at the rehearsal dinner, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. I'd forced a smile, my cheeks burning, while Linda just sipped her wine and said nothing. That was the first time I felt it, the sting of being less in their eyes, but I brushed it off. I loved her, and I thought that meant taking on whatever came with her. Then there was the car. Linda's old sedan broke down a year into her marriage, and instead of fixing it, she showed up one day with a shiny new SUV. "It's perfect, isn't it?" she'd said, twirling the keys like it was a toy. I'd stared at the price tag, my stomach dropping. 40 grand, financed in my name because her credit was shot from years of reckless spending. I paid it off, month by month, while Diane patted my shoulder and said, "Good husbands provide." Linda didn't even thank me, just drove off to show it to her friends. I'd stood in the driveway watching her go, wondering why I kept saying yes. The vacations were worse. Every summer, Diane would plan these over-the-top trips, Hawaii, the Bahamas, places I'd never even dreamed of as a kid. I'd fork over the cash for flights, hotels, dinners, all of it, while Tessa tagged along, racking up bar tabs she'd never pay. One time, in Maui, I caught her charging a $500 spa day to my card. When I asked Linda about it, she just laughed. "It's family, Michael. Relax." Relax? I was working 60-hour weeks to keep up with their family habits, and they acted like I owed it to them. The real kicker was Tessa's debt. 2 years ago, she called Linda crying, saying she'd maxed out 3 cards, 20 grand in clothes, jewelry, and God knows what else. Diane marched into our house the next day, hands on her hips, and said, "Michael, you need to fix this. She's your sister-in-law." I'd stared at her, dumbfounded, but Linda nodded along like it made sense. So I wrote the check, cleared the debt, and watched Tessa blow me a kiss like I was her personal savior. Richard, Linda's dad, was there too, sitting in his armchair, saying nothing. He never did. Too scared of Diane's temper, I guess. I'd always thought he might be on my side, deep down, but he never spoke up, not once. I took a sip of water, the cold glass grounding me as the memories piled up. All those times I told myself I was doing it for Linda, for our life together. I'd assumed it was my job as a husband to step up, to keep the peace. But sitting there in the dim light, I realized something. They didn't respect me for it. They didn't even like me. To them, I was a walking wallet, a means to an end. Linda never defended me, never told her mom to back off or her sister to get a job. She just let it happen every single time. This baby shower payment, though, it wasn't like the others. Sure, I'd agreed to cover it, but as I sat there, my mind started turning. It wasn't a gift. Not some generous gesture they could pat me on the back for. No, this was the first move in something bigger, something I'd been chewing on for a while now. I set the glass down and pulled out my phone, opening a spreadsheet I'd kept hidden. Every expense, every dollar I'd poured into them. It was all there, neatly logged. Wedding, car, vacations, Tessa's debt, and now the shower. I scrolled through it, the numbers glaring back at me, and felt a slow burn in my chest. They thought they had me figured out, that I'd keep playing along forever. But they were wrong. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, staring at the screen. Tomorrow, I'd walk into that baby shower and hand over the money, just like they expected. But it wasn't going to end there. This was the start of my payback, a way to take back everything they'd squeezed out of me. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I could feel it coming together. Plan a way out. I stood up, switched off the TV, and headed upstairs. Linda was asleep, her phone glowing on the nightstand. I looked at her for a moment, then turned away. She had no idea what I was thinking, and neither did her family. Good, let them stay clueless. Tomorrow was going to be the beginning of something they'd never see coming. I pulled into the parking lot of the venue, a fancy hotel with chandeliers visible through the windows and valets scurrying around like ants. It was the kind of place Linda's family loved. Over the top, expensive. A stage for them to strut around and pretend they were royalty. I'm Robert, and today, I was walking into the baby shower from hell. I'd written the check last night, the final payment for this circus, and it was tucked in my jacket pocket. My stomach churned as I handed my keys to the valet, a kid who barely looked old enough to drive. I adjusted my tie, took a deep breath, and stepped inside, knowing full well what I was in for. Another day of fake smiles, snide comments, and being treated like I didn't belong. But this time I was ready for it. The lobby was buzzing with people. Women in pastel dresses and men in crisp suits, all chattering about the perfect day Linda's mom, Diane, had planned. I spotted her right away, holding court near the entrance to the banquet hall. Her voice loud and commanding as she waved her arms like a conductor. Tessa was next to her, snapping selfies, her dress so tight I wondered how she could breathe. Linda stood a few feet away, glowing in a white gown that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She saw me and gave a little wave, but there was no warmth in it, just expectation. I nodded back, keeping my face neutral, and made my way over. "You're late," Diane said before I could even say hello, her eyes narrowing like I'd insulted her personally. "Traffic," I muttered, not bothering to explain. She huffed, then turned back to her guests, dismissing me without another word. I followed the crowd into the banquet hall, the air thick with perfume and the clink of champagne glasses. The room was decked out, flowers everywhere. A massive cake shaped like a crib, a gift table piled high with boxes wrapped in shiny paper. I scanned the seating chart near the door, looking for my name, and that's when I felt it, a cold prickle down my spine. My spot wasn't with Linda or her family, not even close. I walked toward the back, past the main tables where everyone was laughing and toasting, until I found it. A single chair shoved up against the wall, right in front of the restroom door. My blood ran cold as I stared at it. A small air freshener sat on the table, plugged into the outlet, humming quietly. Next to it was a handwritten sign and Tessa's loopy scrawl, "Warning, strong odor." I stood there, frozen, as the pieces clicked together. This wasn't an accident. They planned it. Laughter erupted behind me, sharp and cruel. I turned to see Linda leaning against the gift table, her hand over her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Diane was next to her, smirking like she just won a prize, and Tessa was snapping pictures with her phone, giggling like a kid. The guests nearby joined in, their chuckles bouncing off the walls, and I felt every eye in the room on me. Linda walked over, still grinning, and leaned in close. "It's just a joke, honey. A special seat, just for you." Her voice was light, playful, but it cut through me like a knife. I looked at her, my wife, the woman I'd built a life with, and saw nothing but amusement in her eyes. No shame, no apology, just a game they'd all decided to play at my expense. I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth ached. But I didn't say a word. What could I say? Yelling would only make it worse, give them more fuel to twist the story later. Poor Michael, always so dramatic. So, I pulled out the chair, the legs scraping against the floor, and sat down. The restroom door swung open behind me. A whiff of bleach and cheap soap hitting my nose as some guy walked out, glancing at me with a mix of pity and confusion. The air freshener buzzed louder, like it was mocking me too. I folded my hands on the table, staring straight ahead, my mind racing. They thought this was funny. Huh? Thought they could keep pushing me down, making me the punchline? Fine, let them laugh. Let them think they'd won this round. I watched as the party kicked into gear, waiters weaving through the crowd with trays of appetizers, shrimp, caviar, little pastries I'd probably paid for. Linda flitted from table to table, soaking up the attention, while Diane barked orders at the staff like she owned the place. Tessa kept snapping photos, probably posting them online with captions about how hilarious this all was. I stayed put, the noise of the room fading into a dull hum as I focused on the check in my pocket. I'd hand it over soon, play my part, but inside, something was building, a countdown, a ticking clock I could almost hear. This wasn't just about today. It was every slight, every jab, every time they'd made me feel small, piling up until I couldn't ignore it anymore. I shifted in my seat, the hardwood digging into my back, and let my eyes drift across the room. Richard, Linda's dad, was at the main table, quiet as usual, his head down over a plate of food. He never said much, never stepped in when Diane or the girls went too far. I used to think he was just weak, But now I wondered if he was as tired of this as I was. Didn't matter, he wouldn't help me. No one here would. The laughter had died down. But I could still feel the stares, the whispers, the smug satisfaction radiating from Linda and her family. They thought they had me right where they wanted me, pinned down and powerless. But they were wrong. I reached for the glass of water a waiter had finally dropped off, the ice clinking as I took a slow sip. My hands were steady, my breathing even, but inside, I was on fire. This seat, this joke, it was the last straw, the final push I needed. I set the glass down and leaned back, the restroom door banging open again behind me. Let them have their fun. Let them think I'd take it like I always did. Because in my head, the countdown had already started. And when it hit 0, they'd see a side of me they never expected. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I sat there in that ridiculous chair by the restroom, the air freshener buzzing like a tiny drill in my ear, watching the baby shower unfold like some twisted play I'd been forced to star in. I'm Robert, and tonight I was done pretending. The waiters moved through the room, their trays loaded with filet mignon, lobster tails, and glasses of wine that probably cost more per bottle than I made in a day. The smell of it all drifted over, rich and heavy, but my table stayed empty. I noticed it right away. The staff avoided me like I was invisible, their eyes sliding past me as they served everyone else. I leaned back, arms crossed, waiting, knowing they'd get to me eventually. And they did last, of course. A waiter finally dropped a plate in front of me, the meat cold, the sauce congealed, like it had been sitting out for an hour. I didn't touch it, just stared at it, my stomach turning, not from hunger but from the sheer disrespect. Across the room, Linda laughed with her friends, her white dress catching the light as she tossed her hair. Diane stood nearby, barking at a server about some tiny detail, her voice cutting through the chatter. Tessa was taking selfies again, probably posting about how perfect everything was. They didn't even glance my way, not once. I was the ghost at their party, the guy who paid for it all but didn't matter. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw another waiter heading toward me, a silver tray in his hands. He stopped in front of my table, his face blank, and set the tray down with a soft clink. "Your payment, sir," he said, his voice flat, like he was reading a script. I frowned, reaching for the envelope he'd placed there. It was thin, unmarked, but I knew what it was before I even opened it. My fingers tore the paper, and there it was, a bill for $22,000, the entire cost of this damn baby shower. I stared at the number, my pulse thudding in my ears. Not just the final payment I'd agreed to, everything, the venue, the food, the flowers, the cake, all of it, dumped on me like I was their personal bank. I looked up, and there they were, Linda and Diane, watching me from across the room. Linda raised her champagne glass, a smug little smile on her lips. "You got this, right, babe?" she called out, loud enough for the tables nearby to hear. Diane nodded, her arms crossed, her eyes daring me to argue. Guests turned, some chuckling, others pretending not to notice, but I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. They weren't just taking my money, they were humiliating me, right here in front of everyone. I picked up my water glass, the ice long melted, and took a slow sip, letting the moment stretch out. My mind was racing, but my face stayed calm. I'd gotten good at that over the years. Inside, though, I was boiling. This wasn't a mistake or a mix-up. They planned it, probably laughed about it over coffee, figuring I'd just roll over like always. Pay the bill, smile, take the hit. But as I set the glass down, something snapped into place. This was it, the final straw. I'd been bending for them for years, breaking my back to keep them happy, and this was how they thanked me? A cold plate and a $22,000 tab, served up with a side of mockery? I looked at Linda again, her glass still raised, waiting for my reaction. Diane's smirk hadn't budged, and Tessa was whispering something to a friend, both of them giggling. I could have stood up right then, made a scene, thrown the bill back in their faces. But that's what they wanted, drama they could spin. A story to tell about how I'd ruined the day. No, I wasn't going to give them that. Instead, I folded the bill neatly, slipped it into my pocket next to the check I'd brought, and leaned back in mine. "Don't worry," I said, loud enough for them to hear, my voice steady as I forced a smile. "I'll take care of everything." Linda's grin widened, and Diane gave a little nod, like I'd passed some test. They thought they'd won, that I was still their puppet. They had no idea what was coming. I sat there, letting the party swirl around me, the clatter of plates and the hum of voices fading into the background. My hands rested on the table, calm, but my mind was already miles ahead. I thought about the check in my pocket, the one I'd written last night, the final payment Linda had begged for. I'd give it to them, sure, but this bill? This $22,000 slap in the face? That was something else. They didn't know I'd been keeping track, that I had records of every penny I'd poured into their lives. They didn't know I'd been talking to a lawyer, that I'd been quietly untangling myself from their mess. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about power, and they just handed me the perfect opening. I watched a waiter clear a table nearby, stacking plates with quick, practiced moves. The air freshener buzzed again, the restroom door swinging open as someone else walked out, brushing past me without a word. I didn't care. Let them keep their little game going. Let them think I was still the same old Michael, the pushover they could kick around. I took another sip of water, the glass cool against my lips, and felt a strange peace settle over me. I'd pay the bill. Hell, I'd pay for the whole damn night if they wanted, but it'd be on my terms now. They'd pushed me too far, and I was done playing nice. I glanced at my watch. The night was still young. Plenty of time for their speeches and toasts, plenty of time for them to dig their hole deeper. I'd sit here, eat my cold food, smile when they looked my way, but inside, I was already gone. This was the last time they'd pull this on me, the last time I'd let them laugh at my expense. I patted the pocket with the bill, feeling the edges of the paper through my jacket. Everything, I muttered under my breath, the word tasting sharp and final. They thought they'd humiliated me, but they were wrong. They'd just lit the match and I was ready to burn it all down. I sat there at that stupid table by the restroom, the $22,000 bill burning a hole in my pocket, while the baby shower carried on like nothing had happened. I'm Robert, and right then I was done being their punching bag. The laughter had faded, the guests too busy with their lobster and wine to care about me anymore. But I could still feel Linda and Diane's smugness from across the room. They thought they'd pulled it off, stuck me with the whole tab, and I'd just take it like always. My plate of cold food sat untouched in front of me, the air freshener humming like a taunt, but I didn't react. Not yet. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crack. Not here, not now. Instead, I pushed my chair back, stood up, and excused myself with a quiet, "Be right back." Linda barely glanced my way, too busy giggling with Tessa, and Diane didn't notice at all. Good. Let them think I was just stepping out to sulk. I walked into the hallway, the noise of the party muffled as the heavy doors swung shut behind me. The air was cooler out here, cleaner, and I took a deep breath, pulling my phone from my pocket. My hands were steady, but inside, I was buzzing in anger. Sure, but something else too. Clarity. I'd been waiting for this, maybe without even knowing it, and that bill was the shove I needed. I scrolled through my apps, opening a folder I'd kept hidden, locked behind a password Linda didn't know. Financial records, years of them, stared back at me. Bank statements, credit card logs, loan documents, every single expense I'd covered for her and her family, all neatly organized. The wedding, the car, the vacations, Tessa's debt. I tracked it all, not even sure why at the time. Now I knew. It was ammunition. I leaned against the wall, the smooth plaster cool against my back, and kept scrolling. The numbers added up fast, tens of thousands, then hundreds, every dollar a piece of me they'd taken without a second thought. I stopped at the latest entry, the baby shower payment I'd agreed to, and felt my jaw tighten. They didn't just want my money, they wanted my dignity, too. That joke with the seat, the cold food, the bill on a silver tray, it wasn't enough to use me. They had to rub it in my face. I closed the folder and opened my messages, finding the thread with Daniel, my lawyer. He'd been on standby for weeks, ever since I'd started wondering how much more I could take. My fingers hovered over the screen, then typed, "Execute Operation Green. Final review confirmed." I hit send, my heart thudding but steady. This was it, no going back. Daniel's reply came in seconds, all set. Awaiting your signal. I read it twice, letting the words sink in. Operation Green wasn't just a catchy name. It was my exit strategy. A plan we'd built piece by piece. Divorce papers, asset freezes, legal claims for reimbursement, it was all there, ready to roll out when I gave the word. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and straightened up, running a hand through my hair. I could still hear the faint hum of the party through the doors, the clink of glasses, the occasional burst of laughter. They had no idea what I was doing out here. No clue I just pulled the pin on a grenade they wouldn't see until it blew up in their faces. I fixed my tie, smoothing it down with both hands, and checked my reflection in a nearby mirror. I looked calm, collected, normal. That was the key. They couldn't know anything was different. Not yet. I had one last thing to do tonight, one final move to play before I walked away from this mess for good. I reached into my jacket, feeling the check I'd brought, the final payment Linda had begged for, and beside it, the crumpled bill they'd dumped on me. I'd give them the check, sure. But the rest? That was mine to settle later, my way. I adjusted my suit jacket, squared my shoulders, and pushed the doors open, stepping back into the banquet hall. The room hit me like a wave, lights too bright, voices too loud, the smell of perfume and food mixing into something overwhelming. Linda was at the gift table now, cooing over a stack of presents, while Diane hovered nearby, directing the staff like a general. Tessa was still on her phone, oblivious. I made my way back to my seat, the restroom door banging open behind me as someone stumbled out, muttering an apology. I ignored it, settling into the chair with a slow, deliberate calm. My water glass was still there, half empty, and I picked it up, taking a sip as I watched them. They thought I was beaten, that I'd slink back in and play along. Let them think that. It'd make what came next even sweeter. I set the glass down and leaned back, my hands resting on the table. The party was winding down now, the energy shifting as people finished their meals and started eyeing the cake. I could feel the check in my pocket, a small weight against my chest, and I knew what I'd do with it. I'd hand it over, smile, let them think they'd won the night. But it wasn't just a payment, it was a promise, a quiet little gift they'd unwrap later when the lawyers came knocking. I glanced at Linda again, her laughter ringing out as she held up a tiny onesie for everyone to see. She looked happy, carefree, like nothing could touch her. Diane caught my eye for a second, her smirk still there, and I gave her a small nod. Keep smiling, I thought. You've got no idea what's coming. I shifted in my seat, the hardwood creaking under me, and let my mind settle. This was the quiet before the storm, the moment I'd look back on as the turning point. I didn't need to shout or fight, not yet. The real execution was already in motion, ticking away in the background, and all I had to do was wait. I patted my pocket again, feeling the edges of the check and the bill, and let a faint smile tug at my lips. One last gift for my wife, one last play for her family. They'd pushed me too far, and now they'd pay quietly, cleanly, and on my terms. I took another sip of water, the ice long gone, and sat back to watch the show. The countdown was on, and I was ready. I stood near the back of the banquet hall, my hands in my pockets, watching Linda tear into another gift from the pile that towered over the table. A Robert, and tonight I was about to drop a bomb they'd never forget. The baby shower had dragged on, the air thick with champagne fumes and the cloying scent of flowers, but I'd stayed calm, biding my time. My seat by the restroom was behind me now, the air freshener still buzzing faintly as I leaned against the wall, out of the spotlight. Linda had barely noticed I'd moved. She was too busy squealing over designer baby clothes and silver rattles, her friends clapping like she'd won an award. Diane was in her element, strutting around, making sure everyone knew she'd orchestrated this overpriced mess. Tessa snapped photos, her fake smile plastered on, while Richard sat quietly at the main table, picking at his dessert. Same old scene, same old family, except tonight I was rewriting the script. I'd watched her open dozens of gifts already, each one more extravagant than the last. Strollers that cost more than my first car, a crib with hand-carved details, stuff we didn't even need. Every you and awe from the crowd grated on me, but I kept my face blank, my breathing steady. Then Diane's voice cut through the noise, sharp and dramatic, like she was announcing royalty. And now Michael's gift to his wife. Heads turned, eyes locking on me, and I felt the room shift. Linda looked up, surprised, her hands pausing over a box of cashmere blankets. Tessa lowered her phone, smirking like she expected something lame. Diane crossed her arms, her lips twitching, probably thinking I'd cough up another check to keep them happy. I stepped forward, pulling the small envelope from my jacket and walked toward the gift table, my shoes clicking against the polished floor. The crowd parted a little, whispers rippling through them as I handed the envelope to Linda. She took it, her brow furrowing, and I saw a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "What's this?" she asked, her voice low, like she didn't want anyone else to hear. I didn't answer, just stepped back, hands back in my pockets, and watched. She tore it open, her fingers quick, and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. Her face changed in an instant, color draining, eyes widening, lips parting like she couldn't breathe. "What the hell is this?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Diane snatched it from her before I could blink, scanning the page with a speed that made her glasses slip down her nose. Her smug look vanished, replaced by a mix of shock and fury as she read. I took a step closer, my voice calm but firm, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "It's a full breakdown of every dollar I've spent on this family, totaling $170,000, including today's baby shower. But here's the best part, I've officially filed for reimbursement through legal means." The words hung in the air, heavy and final, and the room went dead silent. No clinking glasses, no chatter, no laughter, just the sound of my own heartbeat steady in my chest. Linda's head snapped up, her eyes locked on mine, wide with disbelief. Diane crumpled the paper in her fist, her face twisting like she'd been slapped. Tessa's phone slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor, and the guests stared, mouths open, frozen mid-sip or mid-bite. I stood there, letting it sink in, watching their perfect little world crack right in front of me. The list was detailed. Every payment I'd tracked over the years, from the wedding to Tessa's credit card debt, all laid out in black and white. And at the bottom, the kicker, a legal notice, filed that afternoon with Daniel's help, demanding they repay me. I'd known this moment was coming since I'd texted him in the hallway, but saying it out loud, seeing their faces, it felt better than I'd imagined. Linda's hands shook, the paper trembling as Diane shoved it back at her. "You can't do this," Linda hissed, her voice low but venomous. "This is insane." Diane stepped forward, her finger jabbing at me. "This is your wife's baby shower, Michael. You're embarrassing us." I didn't flinch. "Embarrassing you?" I said, my tone even, almost amused. "You stuck me with a $22,000 bill and put me next to the toilet for laughs. I think you've done a fine job of that yourselves." A few gasps rippled through the crowd, and I saw some guests shift uncomfortably, their eyes darting between us. Linda's face turned red, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't find the words. Diane sputtered, her hands balling into fists, but I didn't let her get a word in. "It's done," I said, cutting through the tension. "The lawyers have it now. You'll hear from them soon." I turned slightly, catching Richard's eye. He looked up from his plate, his face pale, but he didn't say anything, just stared, like he was seeing me for the first time. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until Tessa broke it with a shrill, "You're such a jerk, Michael." She stomped her foot like that would change anything, but I ignored her. My focus was on Linda, who was still clutching the paper, her eyes glistening with tears now. Anger, not sadness, I could tell. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice cracking. I shrugged, keeping my hands in my pockets. "You made it easy," I said simply. "All of you did." I stepped back, letting the words land, and felt the weight lift off me. This was it, the gift that changed everything, the moment I stopped being their doormat. The room stayed quiet, the air buzzing with shock as I turned and walked back toward my spot. I didn't sit down, just stood there, watching them unravel. Diane started whispering furiously to Linda, who shook her head, tears spilling now. Tessa grabbed her phone off the floor, typing something fast, probably whining to her followers. The guests murmured, some looking at me with pity, others with something like respect. I didn't care either way, this wasn't about them. It was about me finally taking back what was mine, my money, my pride, my life. I'd given them one last gift, all right, and it was better than anything on that table. They'd remember this night forever, not as their triumph, but as mine, and I wasn't done yet. I stood at the back of the banquet hall, the air still crackling from the bomb I'd just dropped, watching Linda and her family scramble to process what I'd done. I'm Robert, and tonight, the reckoning had begun. The silence after I'd announced the $170,000 reimbursement claim didn't last long. Diane was the first to explode, her voice slicing through the room like a blade. "You can't be serious," she shouted, her face twisted in anger, her hands shaking as she waved the crumpled paper I'd given Linda. "This is your wife's baby shower, Michael. You're making a fool of us all." I smirked, crossing my arms, and let her words bounce off me. She was red-faced, spitting mad, but I didn't budge. I'd spent years swallowing their garbage, and now it was their turn to choke on mine. Linda was still at the gift table, the paper trembling in her hands, tears streaking her makeup. She looked at me, her eyes burning with fury, and I could see the gears turning. She was trying to figure out how to spin this, how to make me the bad guy. "You're really doing this?" she said, her voice low and venomous. "Here?" "No." I nodded, keeping my tone steady. "Yeah, Linda. Here. Now." Before she could snap back, I reached into my jacket and pulled out another envelope. This one thicker, heavier. I stepped forward and set it in front of her, right on top of the pile of unopened gifts. "And this," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "is my official petition for divorce. Plus, just so you know, I've secured a court order to freeze you out of my credit cards and bank accounts. Effective immediately." The room erupted, gasps, murmurs. A few choked laughs from the guests who couldn't believe what they were seeing. Linda's face went from red to white in a heartbeat, her mouth dropping open like I punched her. "You wouldn't dare," she hissed, her voice shaking with rage. I met her eyes, unflinching. "I already did." Diane lunged forward, snatching the envelope and tearing it open, her glasses slipping down her nose as she scanned the pages. "This is absurd," she yelled, throwing it back on the table. "You can't just walk away like this. We're family." I laughed, a short, bitter sound that made her flinch. "Family," I said. "You've treated me like a damn ATM for years. That ends tonight." Tessa jumped in then, her shrill voice cutting through the chaos. "You're ruining everything, Michael. You're such a loser." She stomped over, hands on her hips, like she could bully me into backing down. I ignored her, my focus on Linda, who was clutching the divorce papers now, her knuckles white. The guests were whispering, some pulling out their phones, probably texting about the drama unfolding in front of them. I didn't care. Let them talk. Let the whole world know. I'd been quiet too long, and now I was done. Diane tried to rally, stepping closer, her finger jabbing at me again. "You'll regret this," she snarled. "You think you can just humiliate us and walk away?" I shrugged, calm as ever. "Watch me." Then, out of nowhere, Richard's voice broke through the storm. He'd been silent all night, like always, sitting at the main table with his head down. But now he stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "Diane, Linda," he said, his tone quiet but firm, "you both pushed too far." The room went still again, everyone turning to look at him. His face was tired, lined with years of keeping his mouth shut, but his eyes were sharp. Diane spun on him, her jaw dropping. "What did you say?" she snapped. Richard didn't back down. "You heard me," he said. "This has gone on long enough. Michael's right. You've treated him like dirt." I stared at him, caught off guard. In all the years I'd known him, he'd never stood up to them, not once. But there he was, finally saying something, and it hit harder than I expected. Linda turned on him next, her voice rising. "Dad, stay out of this." But Richard shook his head, his hands steady as he adjusted his tie. "No, Linda. I should have said something years ago. You and your mother, you've taken him for granted." Diane's face went purple, her mouth working like she couldn't believe it. But Richard didn't stop. "He's paid for everything, our trips, your sister's messes, this whole night, and you thank him by sticking him next to the bathroom? I'm ashamed of you both." The words landed like a slap, and for a second, I saw Linda falter, her anger flickering into something else. Guilt, maybe, or fear. Diane recovered fast, though, rounding on him. "Don't you dare lecture me, Richard. This is your daughter's day." He just looked at her, then sat back down, done talking but not done making his point. I stood there, watching it all unfold, a strange mix of satisfaction and exhaustion washing over me. The guests were buzzing now, the whispers turning into full-on conversations, but I tuned them out. Richard's words didn't change what I'd done. They just made it sweeter. I glanced at Linda, who was glaring at me, the divorce papers still in her hands. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low, a promise of more fights to come. "Good," I shot back. "I'm ready." Diane tried one last jab, stepping closer. "You'll pay for this, Michael. Legally, financially, you name it." I smiled, a real one this time. "Bring it on, Diane. I've got nothing left to lose." I turned away, walking back toward the wall, leaving them to stew in their mess. The room was a circus now, Linda crying, Diane yelling. Tessa whining to anyone who'd listen, but I felt lighter than I had in years. The divorce was filed, the accounts were locked, and the reimbursement claim was in motion. They could scream all they wanted, it wouldn't change a thing. I leaned against the wall, hands in my pockets, and watched them fall apart. This was just the beginning, and I was ready for whatever came next. They'd underestimated me for the last time, and now they'd learn what that cost. The reckoning was here, and I was the one holding the reins. I stood against the wall of the banquet hall, the chaos I'd unleashed still swirling around me, but I felt steady, rooted, like a weight had finally lifted. I'm Robert, and tonight the fallout was in full swing. Linda was at the gift table, sobbing now, the divorce papers crumpled in her hands, her perfect white dress stained with mascara-streaked tears. Diane was pacing, her voice a shrill bark as she snapped at Richard, who sat quietly, his face set in a rare show of resolve. Tessa was flitting around, whining to anyone who'd listen, her phone glued to her hand as she typed furiously, probably blasting me online. The guests were a mix of stunned silence and awkward chatter, some slipping out the door to escape the mess. I dropped my bombs, reimbursement claim, divorce petition, account freezes, and now I was watching the pieces fall, calm as ever. Diane tried to take charge, storming over to me with her hands on her hips. "This isn't over, Michael." She spat, her eyes wild. "You think you can just ruin my daughter's day and walk away? I'll drag you through every court in this state." I looked at her, unflinching, and shrugged. "Go ahead, Diane. I've got everything locked down, my lawyer's better than yours." Her mouth twisted, but before she could fire back, Tessa jumped in, her voice high and dramatic. "You're a monster, Michael. How could you do this to Linda? To the baby?" I glanced at her, then at Linda, who was wiping her face with a napkin. Her sobs quieter now but still loud enough to draw pity. "The baby'll be fine," I said coolly. "I'm not walking away from my kid. Just you." Tessa huffed, stopping off, and Diane threw her hands up, muttering curses as she turned back to Linda. I'd seen this coming, knew they'd try to make a scene, paint me as the villain. But I'd planned for it. Earlier that day, before I'd even left for the shower, I'd called Daniel and finalized everything. My name was off the joint accounts, the credit cards canceled, the savings moved to a new bank they couldn't touch. They couldn't drain me anymore, no matter how loud they screamed. I watched Linda pull herself together, her friends crowding around her, cooing and patting her back. She shot me a look, pure venom, and I knew she'd fight dirty. Fine. I was ready. The court order was ironclad, and the divorce papers were filed. She could cry all she wanted, it wouldn't change the facts. Richard stood up again, surprising me for the second time that night. He walked over to Diane, his voice low but firm. "Enough, Diane. You're making it worse." She spun on him, her face a mask of disbelief. "Worse? He's the one tearing this family apart." Richard shook his head, his hands in his pockets. "No, you did that. You and Linda, you pushed him too far, and I let it happen." I stared at him, caught off guard again. He'd always been the silent one, the guy who faded into the background while Diane ran the show. But now he was looking at me, his eyes steady. "I'm sorry, Michael," he said quietly. "I should have stepped in years ago." I didn't know what to say. Things didn't feel right. Not after everything. So I just nodded. He turned back to Diane, who was fuming, and added, "You need to stop. This is done." Diane didn't stop, of course. She marched over to the gift table, grabbing Linda's arm. "We're not letting him win," she hissed, loud enough for me to hear. "We'll fight this. Every penny, every paper." Linda nodded, her jaw tight, and I saw the fire reignite in her eyes. They'd come after me, no doubt, lawsuits, sob stories, whatever they could throw. But I wasn't worried. Daniel had prepped me for this, and I'd covered my tracks. The $170,000 claim was backed by years of receipts, bank records, proof they couldn't deny. The divorce was clean, prenup in place, my assets protected. They could flail all they wanted. I was untouchable now. The guests were thinning out, some muttering apologies to Linda as they grabbed their coats, others shooting me curious looks. I stayed where I was, leaning against the wall, hands in my pockets. The waiters started clearing tables, stacking plates with quick, quiet moves, and I caught one of them glancing at me. A flicker of sympathy, maybe, or just exhaustion. Didn't matter. The party was over, and so was my role in the circus. Diane tried one last jab, storming back over with Linda trailing behind. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "We'll make sure of it." I smiled, small and cold. "Good luck with that. You're on your own now." Linda stepped forward, her eyes wet but hard. "I hate you," she whispered, and I felt it, sharp, but not deep. "Yeah," I said simply. "I figured." They turned away, Diane dragging Linda toward the exit, Tessa following with a dramatic sob. Richard lingered for a moment, looking at me like he wanted to say more, then shook his head and walked out too. The room emptied fast after that, leaving me with the hum of the air freshener and the faint clatter of cleanup. I pushed off the wall, my legs stiff from standing so long, and took one last look around. The flowers were wilting, the cake half-cut, the gifts scattered, their perfect night in ruins. I felt no guilt, no second thoughts, just relief. I pulled out my phone, texting Daniel, "It's done." "They're pissed, but it's over." His reply came quick. "Good. We're ready for the next step." I slipped the phone back in my pocket and headed for the door, the check I'd brought still there. Unneeded now. They billed me for everything anyway. Let them figure out how to pay it without me. I stepped into the cool night air, the valet bringing my car around, and slid into the driver's seat. The engine hummed as I pulled out, the hotel shrinking in my rear view. The fallout was just starting, but I was already free of their grip, their games, their weight. They'd fight, sure, but I'd won this round, and I wasn't looking back. I sat on the couch in my new condo, a beer in my hand, the city skyline stretching out beyond the window like a promise of something better. I'm Robert, and 2 weeks after the baby shower blowout, I was finally starting over. The place was small but mined clean lines, hardwood floors, a view that made the chaos of the last month feel miles away. I'd moved out the day after the shower, packing my stuff while Linda was still reeling, her threats ringing in my ears as I loaded the car. She'd screamed. Diane had called me every name in the book, but I didn't argue, just laughed. Now here I was, free of their house, their rules, their weight, and it felt damn good. The divorce was rolling forward, Daniel handling the details, and for the first time in years, I could breathe. The TV was on, some news channel droning in the background, but my mind was elsewhere on how fast things had unraveled for them. Linda's credit card started getting declined a few days after the shower, thanks to the court order I'd secured. I'd heard through a mutual friend that she tried to buy a new designer bag, something to cheer herself up, and the cashier had handed the card back with a shrug. Diane had to step in, but her accounts weren't bottomless either. Word got around they'd sold Linda's SUV last week, the one I'd paid off, and Tessa was whining online about having to downsize her apartment. Their luxurious lifestyle was crumbling, brick by brick, and I didn't feel an ounce of pity. They'd built it on my back, and now they were learning what happened when I stopped carrying them. I took a sip of my beer, the cold bottle sweating against my palm, and leaned back, letting the quiet settle in. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. Another email from Daniel, updating me on the proceedings. The reimbursement claim was moving forward, too. We'd filed the paperwork, and their lawyer was scrambling to counter it. They didn't have much to stand on. My records were airtight, years of proof they couldn't argue with. Linda had tried calling a few times, leaving voicemails I didn't listen to, but I'd blocked her number yesterday. No point in dragging it out. She'd made her bed, and I wasn't lying in it anymore. Daniel said she'd probably settle soon, once the reality sank in, but I wasn't holding my breath. She'd fight until the end, just to spite me. The condo was still half empty, boxes stacked in the corner, a single chair at the kitchen counter, but I didn't mind. It was a fresh start, a blank slate. I'd picked it out fast, signed the lease the day after I left, and moved in with what little I cared to keep. No fancy furniture, no memories of them, just the essentials and a bed that didn't smell like Linda's perfume. I'd spent the first night staring at the ceiling, not sleeping much, but feeling lighter than I had in years. The silence was mine now, not theirs to fill with demands or insults. I got up, walking to the window, and looked out at the lights twinkling below. This was my space, my life, and they couldn't touch it. Work had picked up, too, a silver lining I hadn't expected. A firm in San Francisco had been eyeing me for months, and last week, they'd made an offer. Senior consultant, better pay, a chance to start over on the West Coast. I said yes without hesitating. The move was still a few weeks off, paperwork to finish, the divorce to finalize, but it was locked in. I told Daniel about it yesterday, and he'd laughed, saying, "You're really doing it." Huh? Full reset. Yeah, I was. No more East Coast winters. No more running into Linda's friends at the grocery store. No more ghosts of that life. San Francisco was a clean break, and I couldn't wait. I set the beer down and grabbed my laptop from the couch, pulling up the San Francisco listing Daniel had sent. A furnished apartment near the bay, modern, with a balcony I could already picture myself on. It was more than I'd planned to spend, but I could afford it now, with my account safe and the divorce splitting what little we'd shared. Linda would get the house, let her deal with the mortgage, but I'd kept my savings, my investments, everything I'd built. The reimbursement claim might take months, maybe years, but even if I didn't see a dime, I'd won. They couldn't bleed me dry anymore, and that was enough. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from an old college buddy. "Mark, heard about the shower. You okay?" I smiled, typing back, "Better than okay. Free." He replied with a thumbs up and a drink soon. I said yes, feeling a flicker of something normal friends, a life outside their mess. I'd been so wrapped up in Linda's world, I'd forgotten what that felt like. Now I could rebuild it piece by piece on my terms. I closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water to chase the beer. The counter was bare, no clutter, no bills from them piling up, and it hit me how much I'd carried for so long. I thought about Richard's words at the shower, how he'd finally stood up, and wondered if he'd stick to it. Probably not. Diane would wear him down, but it didn't matter. He'd said his piece and I'd walked away. The world was seeing them for what they were now. Spoiled, selfish, scrambling to hold on to a life they couldn't afford. Linda's Instagram was quiet these days. Tessa's posts less flashy, and Diane's brunches with her rich friends had dried up. From what I'd heard, they'd overplayed their hand, and I'd called their bluff. I went back to the couch, sinking into it, and let my head rest against the cushion. The TV flickered, a weather report predicting sun tomorrow, and I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. This was my new beginning, not just a condo or a job, but a chance to be me again, not their puppet. I'd thrived despite them, and now I'd thrive without them. The beer was warm now, but I finished it anyway, savoring the quiet victory. They'd thought they could break me, but they'd only set me free. San Francisco was waiting, and I was ready. New city, new life, new me. I stood on the balcony of my new high-rise apartment in San Francisco, a glass of whiskey in my hand, the city sprawling out below me like a glittering map of possibilities. I'm Robert, and a month after the baby shower showdown, I'd finally claimed the last laugh. The air was cool, tinged with salt from the bay, and I took a slow sip, letting the burn settle in my chest. The move had gone smooth, boxes unpacked, new job started, a rhythm to my days that felt like mine alone. The divorce wasn't final yet, but Daniel had it under control, and Linda's threats had fizzled into silence. Tonight, though, she'd broken that silence with a call, and I'd let it play out, curious to see what she'd say. I wasn't the same man she'd pushed around, and she was about to find out. My phone had buzzed an hour ago, her name flashing on the screen, and I'd almost let it go to voicemail. But something, maybe the whiskey, maybe the view, made me pick up. "Michael, can we talk?" she'd said, her voice softer than I'd heard in years, almost pleading. I'd smirked, leaning back in my chair, and took a sip before answering. "Sorry, Linda. I have plans." Then I hung up, cutting her off before she could argue. No explanation, no second chances, just the click of the call ending, final and clean. I'd walked out here after that, the night air hitting my face, and felt a rush of satisfaction. She didn't get to pull me back, not now, not ever. I was done being her fallback. I leaned against the railing, the metal cool under my elbows, and looked out at the lights twinkling across the water. That call was her last shot. I figured, a desperate grab at control when everything else had slipped away. Daniel had filled me in yesterday. The house was on the market, the SUV long gone, and Tessa's credit card spree had landed her in collections. Diane was scrambling, selling off jewelry to keep up appearances, but the cracks were showing. Their world had shrunk, and I'd heard through Mark that people were talking, fringe-dropping them, whispers about how they'd treated me spreading like wildfire. They'd thought they could humiliate me, make me the fool at that baby shower, but the script had flipped. Now they were the ones exposed, scrambling to clean up their own mess. The whiskey glass caught the glow of the city, amber liquid shifting as I tilted it. I'd won, not just the money, though the reimbursement claim was still grinding forward, but something bigger. My dignity, my freedom, my life. I'd walked away from that banquet hall with my head high, leaving them to their chaos, and every step since had been mine to take. The new job was better than I'd hoped, long hours, sure, but the kind that paid off in respect, not resentment. My team liked me, the clients trusted me, and the paycheck was enough to make this apartment, this view, my reality. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore, least of all them. I thought back to that night, the restroom seat, the $22,000 bill, the way they'd laughed. It still stung if I let it, but the sting was dull now, overshadowed by what I'd built since. I'd mailed the check for the shower a week later, not because I had to, but because I wanted it done, a final cut of the court. Let them deal with the rest. Daniel said they'd tried to counter the claim, arguing I'd gifted the money over the years, but my records shut that down fast. Every receipt, every transfer, every loan I'd covered, it was all there, a paper trail they couldn't erase. The judge hadn't ruled yet, but Daniel was confident. They've got nothing, he'd said, grinning over coffee last week. You're in the clear. I took another sip, the warmth spreading, and let my mind drift. Linda's voice had sounded small on that call, a far cry from the smug, "You got this, right?" Babe, she'd thrown at me that night. I wondered what she wanted, money, probably, or a way to save face. Maybe she thought I'd soften, let her back in for the sake of the kid. I wouldn't abandon my child, that was never the plan. But her? She was on her own. I'd set up a trust, worked it out with Daniel, made sure the baby would be taken care of without me funneling cash through her hands. She didn't know that yet, but she'd find out soon enough. No more games, no more leverage, just facts. The city hung below, cars weaving through streets, lights flickering like a pulse. I'd settled into San Francisco fast, found a coffee spot I liked, a gym a block away, a bar where the bartender knew my order. Mark had flown out last weekend and we'd hit the town, laughing like we were back in college. "You look different," he'd said over beers, squinting at me like he was trying to figure it out. "Lighter." I'd nodded, clinking my glass against his. "Yeah, I am." He didn't push, just grinned, and we'd moved on to talking about anything but the past. That was the thing about this new life, it didn't need explaining. It just was. I finished the whiskey, the last drop bitter on my tongue, and set the glass on the balcony table. The wind picked up, ruffling my hair, and I closed my eyes, letting it wash over me. They'd underestimated me. Linda, Diane, all of them thought I'd stay small, stay quiet, keep paying for their show. But I'd walked away not just from the marriage but from their whole damn game. The condo, the job, this view, it was mine, earned with my own hands, not theirs. They were back there, picking up the pieces, while I was here, standing tall. I opened my eyes, the city sharp and bright again, and felt a grin tug at my lips. The last laugh was mine, and it tasted better than the whiskey's smooth, strong, final. Linda's call was the end of it, her last gasp before I let her fade into the background for good. I grabbed the glass and headed inside, the doors sliding shut behind me with a soft click. The apartment was quiet, warm, mine. I set the glass in the sink, turned off the lights, and walked to the bedroom, the city glowing through the window. They'd lost, and I'd won, money, dignity, freedom, all of it. And as I lay down, the mattress firm beneath me, I knew this was just the start. The best was still ahead, and it was all mine to take.